Hello, everyone. I'm Supao from Taiwan, and this is my first presentation at Black Hat USA. So thank you, everyone, for joining my session at Black Hat, from spoofing to tunneling. And I'm excited to share some red team networking techniques with you today. So let's take into a typical day in my IT life. Seeing my intranet LDAP server log. There's a login from Frank, and there's a login from Bob, and oh, there's an invalid login from public IP 9.9.9.9. And then how and why this can happen? This is an intranet server without destination NAT. So as an IT, I just banned the bad IP 9.9.9.9. Then, oh no, how is that possible that someone can use a public address to target our internal server? This is the key point that we are going to discuss in this talk. The presentation will explore ways of low-level network penetration testing through a virus of tunneling protocol. These techniques can be used for advanced red teaming exercise or can be blocked before they are abused by the malicious attacker in your corporate network. Before we dive into the details, let me briefly introduce myself. So I'm Su Hao Tong from Taiwan, and I'm a red team trade researcher at Trend Micro, and a Tsinghua University graduate and a former HackerServe president. I love experiment and play with networks and network protocols. I started this research for fun, but it turned out that it is of great importance to general network security. And I'm sharing my GitHub account where you can find this tool or other material from this research. So this is today's agenda. First, I'll share some new red team techniques using IP spoofing and how we can use that for initial access. Then I'll reveal the nightmare of VxLAN, including internal hijacking and how buggy routing protocols can lead to IP hijacking and even domain compromise. And finally, I'll wrap up with some key takeaways before moving on to the Q&A. First, I want to talk about some source IP spoofing in the WAN. We all know that even in recent years, packet spoofing is still possible on public networks. Please note that all the addresses are example addresses and not any common public IPs. An attacker with the IP address 2.2.2.2 can send a DNS request with the source IP of 3.3.3.3. And that does not belong to it. And then when the IP packet arrives 1.1.1, 1.1.1 has no way to verify whether the packet is a spoofed packet or a valid one. And it will send the DNS response to the 3.3.3.3. So 3.3.3.3 receive a DNS response without making a request. This is a typical DDoS DNS amplification attack, and it still works nowadays. Next, I'll dive into the company's network structure, how an IT will block computers from accessing the public network for security purpose. For best practice, when a packet is sent from a crucial server to a public IP, when it arrives to the firewall will drop the packet. However, some IT just disabled NAT. The packet will still forward out to the WAN. And the remote server will see that the source IP is not valid. It will either drop the packet or respond to an unknown address, and the client will not receive the message. So when your code is completely a mess, but it still works. So if we consider both situations together. What would happen if we spoof the source IP address on the intranet? Imagine a writing scenario. The attacker hacked a company device .1.3. He can create a tunnel between the CNC server with the compromised device. After that, it can create a DNS request through the tunnel with source IP is the attacker public IP, which is 9.9.9.9. When the packet arrives at the compromised device, it will forward to the company intranet router. After that, the router will look up its IP table, routing table, and forward it to the second victim. As we know, if there is no firewall for the second victim, .1.2, the response packet will send back to the attackers through the public internet. Then the attacker will receive the packet, which there is no evidence that the packet is come from .1.3. The entire TCP or UDP stream only shows the source IP is 9.9.9 and the destination IP is .1.2. So while IR is hard, in typical lateral movement attacks, the attacker used the IP address of a previous compromised machine to target the next system. This means when an alarm being triggered, an IR team could simply use network log to trace the attacker's path from one compromised machine to the previous one. The IR team could find the relevant log on the previous compromised machine and identify the initial access point, and then shut down the entire attack chain by step. However, when spoofing techniques involved, the source IP in the log will not be the previous compromised machine. So the IR team will not be able to find the attacker path. They could only see a public IP is attacking their domain controller. Thus, the previous compromised machine would not be caught even if the alarm was triggered, and it can change to another public source IP to continue the attack chain. Overlooking the attack path, the malicious packet source and destination IP only shows 9.9.9 and .1.2. Thus, no one will know the previous compromised machine is .1.3. On the other hand, the tunnel IP is HTTP traffic with a source IP 7.7.7.7. If 9.9.9 is banded, the attacker can simply switch to another public IP and attack a different target. The IR team would need to check every router for layer 2 port logs in order to identify the compromised device. Also, the source MAC address can be forged at the first hop. And what if the ISP filter packet that source IP is a private IP? We can use 3.323 NAT pass-through to enable temporary destination NAT. The attacker can send a special packet to 9.9.9. The NAT router will then create a temporary destination NAT for 1.3 port 445 on the public IP port 445. It allows the attacker to access 1.3 on port 449 via 9.9.9. Here's the quick demo. We can see that 241 has a web server at port 8080. Initially, the attacker at 142 could not access the initial web server via the public IP. After we create a server and send a H.323 packet from the compromised machine, we can receive a packet from the victim router, and it gives us the destination port to connect to the internal web server. Also, we can see that the web log source IP is from a public IP rather than a private IP. This creates a breakpoint for the attack chain. Another method discovered by Qinming Cai involves spoofing a fake TCP sync packets from the compromised device, which the source IP is using the next target's IP address .1.3, and send it to the attacker's server. The source NAT mechanism can be abused as a destination NAT to connect the internal service. And this is another quick demo. We can say that the device at .35 have a web server running on 8080. Initially, the attacker at 131 cannot access the internal web server via public IP. After we spoof a sync packet from the compromised machine using the next target IP and port as the source IP and send to the attacker's C2 server, we can then use the destination port from the spoofing packet to connect back to the victim router. The SNAT mechanism will allow us to connect to the internal web server. Additionally, we can see that web server logs show the source IP as a public IP rather than a private one. This also creates a breakpoint in the attack chain. So, do we can replace the C2 terminal with an official VPN? The answer is yes. There are many commercial SSL VPN solutions that can spoof the source IP from the client. As shown in the diagram, commercial SSL VPNs, like those discussed at CyberSec 2025, may allow this behavior. On the other hand, whether open source VPN solutions like WireGuard and OpenVPN are affected depends on their configuration. So here's the initial access. Do we have a chance to do this without an initial foothold in intranet? Can we use any existing terminal? The answer is yes again. On the internet exchange, everyone is on the same layer 2 network. Attacker can set a private network range to the next hop to the router of the company you want to attack. Also, we can abuse existing terminals such as GRE, IPIP, or SIT. But again, a good firewall configuration could cause this to fail. If we compromise the router at an internal exchange, we can force the private subnet as the next hop to the victim company's router. We can create a connection using our own public IP as a source and a private subnet as a destination. The victim router will forward the packet to its intranet subnet and respond to the attacker via the public IPs. On the other hand, we can abuse existing terminal like GRE. GRE is a stateless layer 3 terminal. It is widely used because it is easy to set up and only setting its protocols, public IP, and GRE interface IP. Nowadays, there are still a lot of companies that use GRE in their product, like Cloudflare Magic Transit and its customers. They can use between IPsec or GRE, and IPsec is safer. AWS Transit Gateway also supports GRE terminal, but it's only used for internal network only. Also, Security Week reported that APT groups like Salt Typhoon creates GRE terminal to collect traffic from compromised device. Lastly, there are still a lot of companies use GRE, but we don't know. So, how does the GRE work? When a packet wants to go through a GRE terminal, the kernel will pack the packet with a GRE header and send it over the public internet. At the receiver side, the GRE packet is unpacked, and the inner packet is forwarded according to the routing table. GRE is stateless and doesn't provide encryption, which means it is possible for anyone can spoof GRE packet via public network. For example, .1.2 wants to send a packet to .2.2. Sorry, the packet will send to its default gateway. The gateway router will add a GRE header to the packet and send it over the public network. After the GRE packet arrives at 2.2.2, it will remove the GRE header and forward the inner packet according to its routing table, and vice versa. So how can we find a jar eternal? We can use OSINT techniques. For example, we can search for NetFlow dashboard like Evasion on Google and filter for jar traffic. This way, we can obtain the IP address of both ends of the eternal. Other OSINT techniques can also help. Next, we can use jar spoofing technique to scan for existing jar eternal. First, we can create a fake jar eternal using the command provided above. Then we can create a jar packet with a spoof source IP address. One does not belong to us, and send it over the public network to the victim. If the victim has a jar peer configured with the jar packet, source IP, for example, 1.1.1, it will decapsulate the inner packet and process it according to its IP routing table and forward the inner packet. So we can create and send many different packets with different source IP address to brute force the correct victim peers. If the victim does not recognize the source IP as a known peer, it will drop the packet. On the other hand, if the source matches one of the victim known peers, the victim will accept the jar packet and forward the inner packet according to its routing table. For scanning purpose, we set the destination for the inner packet to the victim itself. So the victim will immediately reply the inner packet with an ICMP response. Then we can identify the victim jar eternal peer IP address. We encode the information into ICMP identifier and sequence field, which together can represent all 255 to the power of 4 possible IPv4 address. We also create a scanner script on GitHub. As you can see, when the jar source address matches the remote jar peer address, we can get an ICMP reply. Then we can put everything together to get an initial access. Let's imagine a scenario where the victim 1.1.1 has a jar eternal with 2.2.2. An attacker can forge a jar packet that appears to be sent for 2.2.2. The inner packet is a DNS request sent from the provider IP 3.3.3 to an intranet network IP. When the packet arrives, the victim will trust and use the jar packet because it's claimed to from 2.2.2. Then the victim will unpack the jar packet and discover that it contains a DNS request, which destination is a private network IP. The victim will then forward the packet to the company's intranet based on its routing table. When the internal DNS server receives the DNS packet, it will respond and send the reply through the public network to the attacker server. Thus, the attacker can interact with the service on the victim's intranet, including those using TCP protocol. We have created a demo lab. The architecture is illustrated in the diagram. The web server is hosted on intranet IP 1.2, and the server can access public network via SNAT. On the other side, the router at IP 1.1 can directly access the intranet server. Also, the router has a public IP and a GRE terminal with the IP address 1.1.1. Okay, and initially, the attacker at IP.142 cannot access the intranet web server .1.2. The attacker can create a spoof GRE terminal to connect the victim router and directly send traffic to the intranet network through the fake terminal. Then the attacker can directly access and interact with the intranet web server. Similarly, if the layer 2 terminal like GRE tab, also if we can leak the victim's MAC address, we can also exploit this in the same way. It is common to use the SNMP protocol to obtain this. For TLDR summary, when a company does not configure its firewall and use stateless unencrypted terminal, even if it's a legacy configuration, an attacker can exploit this terminal for initial access on the internet. Next, I'll reveal a nightmare default configuration of VxLAN. So what is VxLAN? VxLAN is a stateless and unencrypted layer 2 terminal. It packs layer 2 Ethernet frames into layer 4 UDP packet. Each subnet is uniquely identified by a name called VNI. We can configure a VxLAN terminal similar to GRE by giving the remote IP, local IP, at destination port and VNI. However, this configure is vulnerable. Based on the previous configuration, setting up a standard VxLAN peer is easy as usual. How about hijacking a VxLAN terminal? Yeah, here's the only difference. The only change is your local IP argument. So why does this happen? Does the Linux kernel do not check the source IP of VxLAN packet? Why does it accept VxLAN packet with a valid VNI and port, even if the source IP is not configured? After looking at the Linux memo, you will see that this is a feature and not a bug. But this is not secure, and it's turned on by default. Before reporting, RouterOS could not turn off this feature. Now you can change the setting to off, but it's still on by default. So what happens when learning is enabled in VxLAN? Normally, when a config peer sends a VxLAN packet, the kernel will add its MAC address to the FDB, also known as forwarding database table, shown at the bottom on the slide. The next time, a packet needs to be sent to a destination MAC address that is listed in the FDB table. The kernel will pack and send the packet to the remote location using the information from the FDB table. Similarly, when learning mode is enabled, any VxLAN packet with a valid VNI and port will be added to the FDB table. Also, the remote IP can be any IP on the internet. Thus, an attacker 9.9.9.9 can create a VxLAN packet with a MAC address FFFF, and the Linux kernel will add this MAC address to the list. Then, when the kernel wants to send a broadcast packet on the VxLAN interface, it will look up the FDB table and send it to the 9.9.9, which is the attacker's address. So, what doesn't the attacker know in order to hijack the VxLAN? We know our own IP, but we don't know the victim's IP, port, VNI, and or VxLAN inner subnet. However, all this information can be obtained by a simple scan. An attacker can discover the victim IP port and VNI by sending numerous packets. Let's focus on how to determine the VxLAN inner subnet range first. We can gather information by sending a single VxLAN packet where both the source and destination MAC address are set to the broadcast address. Then, when an ARP request sent from VxLAN interface, they will also be sent to the attacker VxLAN. Another method involves sending a neighbor discovery protocol packet. When the RouterOS receives a broadcast neighbor discovery protocol message, it will respond to the broadcasting MAC address with its own IP and MAC address. Thus, we can send numerous VxLAN packets with different VNI and port configurations. Each contains an inner NDP packet where both the source and destination MAC address are set to broadcast address. When the VNI and port matches the victim configuration, the victim device will add the attacker IP to its FTP table. Then, the victim unpacks the VxLAN packet and sees that it is an NDP request. The victim router replies the NDP packet and tries to send the response to the broadcast MAC address. It checks to the FTP table and finds the destination is 9.9.9, which is the attacker IP. So the router will send a packet to the attacker. Then the attacker has everything to hijack the tunnel. We also create a scanner. We can discover the victim IP port and VNI by sending numerous packets. VxLAN has default ports, 4789 and 8472, and VNI usually smaller than 100. Here's the scanner link. We also create a lab for VxLAN scanner demonstration, which includes a RouterOS router and a web server. As you can see, we aim to scan the target at 200. The scanner sends numerous packets with different default ports and different VNIs. Then we can receive a never discovered protocol reply with VNI 42 and port 8472. The inner subnet is 10.0.0.1. Then, by simply create a VxLAN with the information above, we can directly access the VxLAN internet. We also scan for insecure VxLAN configuration worldwide, using VNI equals 1 and default ports. We found that more than 900 VxLAN endpoints respond to the scanner. Additionally, there are 4,000 IPs inside the VxLAN subnet. Some of these are public IPs, which means we can potentially hijack public IPs. Some of those are, additionally, some endpoints reply with numerous broadcast packets combined with the IP spoofing techniques. This could potentially lead to DDoS attack. Lastly, some VxLAN packets have source IP that are private address. This raises a question. Why are private addresses being used as a source IP on the VxLAN packet? I use VxLAN in encrypted kernels, so I am safe? The answer is no. VxLAN will still accept traffic in different interfaces. Due to the VxLAN behavior, it still can be hijacked and scanned. For TLDR, we can hijack a VxLAN terminal using only 3 pieces of information: the victim's IP address, the VxLAN port, and the VNI. There is no need to know the peer IP or the internal IP address. Furthermore, if your network setup include public IP interface and VxLAN on any interface, it is highly vulnerable. So what can hackers do after hijacking a terminal? Not only can attacker gain access to the intranet, but they can also hijack IP communications or perform a man-in-the-middle attacks between two sites. Additionally, attacker can target layer 2 network service such as exploiting RADVD to RCE vulnerabilities. Incident response is challenging because the source IP cannot be trusted. Moreover, this terminal often runs routing protocols like BGP or OSPF. Attacker can hijack IP that are not even transmitted through that terminal, such as those of a domain controller or a EXXI server. So what is a routing protocol? It's a protocol that router can exchange routes and network information with other routers. Routing protocol help router to dynamically learn about the network around them and to determine the best path for forwarding the packet. For example, router A has 192.168.1.0/24, and router C could learn the routes from router B by routing protocols. We often see companies use VxLAN terminal to connect two sites with routing protocols. But when we combine this with the learning feature, we can hijack router A's IP address. Then we can announce domain controller's IP in router protocol with /32. Other router will receive and trust the routing prefix and redirect the domain controller's traffic to the attacker because the route is smaller than /24. We have summarized the potential impact of the hijacking different service IP. If an attacker hijacks the IP of a domain controller and NTLM relay is possible, means SMB sign is disabled or ADCS ECSC8 is present, they can take over the entire domain. If the attacker hijacks the IP of vSphere, Proxima VE, or any HTTPS service, and the original SSL certificate is unsigned or not valid, user may not notice. The attacker then take over the account or false service. In short, hijacking this service IP can lead to account takeovers, denied of service, DNS hijacking, or even full domain compromise. And here's a bonus. A bad configuration in companies' OSPF lead to IP hijacking. This attack vector has been published for years, and we actually observed it during our rating simulation, yet very few people discuss about it. Do you check the TCP dump after you get into an intranet? If you see this, and on the victim intranet, it might be vulnerable. Just like the exploitation method described in the previous slide, if you see a hello packet, there is a high possibility that you can directly establish an OSPF connection with the router and hijack the routes. For example, we can hijack the domain controller at .4.2. So lastly, here are some key takeaways. Here are the key takeaways for Blue Team. First, check all the encrypted terminals in your company networks. If you find any, don't use them. This including protocols like GRE, IPIV, SIT, GRE, TAP, and VxLAN. These terminals are not secure, and it can be abused by attacker. Next, make sure you have a secure firewall in place. Your firewall should filter outbound intranet traffic, especially SYN ACK packets. Also, check for IP spoofing within your intranet. Ideally, all ISPs should filter out spoofing IP address, but in reality, it is rarely possible. Check if OSPF is only enabled on ports between routers. OSPF should not open on unnecessary ports. Monitor your routing prefix for any anomalies. Unexpected change in the routing protocols can indicate an ongoing attack. Finally, set up a minimize accept prefix size in your router protocol, for example, /24. Here are some takeaways for red teamers. First, scan or use OSINT techniques to find victims on encrypted tunnel. This can be an entry point into the networks. Once you are inside the intranet, check the victim network setup for spoofing. Use source IP spoofing techniques during high-risk scanning to avoid detection. Look for OSPF hello message to identify active routing protocols and potential attack paths. Scan for misconfiguration VxLAN terminal. If you find a vulnerable terminal, hijack it to get initial access. And abuse routing protocols and hijack IPs for lateral movement and privilege escalation. Red teams can continue to looking for more vulnerability protocols in the future. Remember, scan, find, hack. Here's the key takeaways for tools maker. First, implement an intranet IP spoofing command and control tool. Develop automation tools to test the possible of IP spoofing within a target internet. Automation saves times. Create automation correction mechanism for mismatch between IP destination and source address within the same TCP session. Some router will still perform SNAT even the package is a server response. Automate the process of sending a .323 package or a new TCP package to trigger router NAT mechanism, especially for ISP that filters private IP as a source address. Develop tools from automate OSPF IP hijack attacks. Finally, implement a more efficient GRE scanner for global scanning, similar to what MassScan does for TCP. So here's a Q&A session. Does anyone have questions? Then thank you, everyone. I'll go to the wrap-up room. If anyone has questions for me, we can meet at the wrap-up room. Thank you.